We have a terrific task ahead of us. We have a shattered world around us, and we must help to rebuild it.
Сегодня еще раз обращаюсь ко всем гражданам России.
The President of the United States.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Welcome back to another episode of Seats of Power. I am Kyle Vella. To my left is John Paul Vella, or JP. We do share a surname, but we are not related. If you see us in real life, I look like Casper the Friendly Ghost, and JP looks like your standard Maltese man. And in front of us is Jake Smith. He is not American or British. He is, in fact, also Maltese. And today we are talking about BRICS and the shifting world order. BRICS mainly stands for the countries Brazil, Russia, India. What does it see? China. What's the S?
South Africa.
South Africa. Okay, sorry. Not a good look for me.
Oh, it's okay. It's just an acronym. I get confused as well. Okay, so BRICS is, I think, is new on most people's vocabulary. I don't think most people know exactly what BRICS is/are. But essentially, what I think it is, it's basically a response to the US/NATO kind of, and European Union kind of alliances, both economic ones, military ones, and whatnot. Now, a lot of people, obviously, in the West are going to be alarmed when they see, China and Russia and Brazil and large economies, ultimately, that are kind of taking a step back from that Western hegemony around the world and assessing things for themselves and kind of not really participating in the Western kind of game. I'm not as informed, I'm going to be completely honest, about BRICS per se, but at the same time you can analyze it still from an outside perspective, and you can tell exactly what kind of what were the events that kind of led up to the establishment of it. What do you think, JP?
Well, it's always been, for the last 8 years now, there's been this dichotomy of East and West in the world. You have the capitalist Western powers, and, the East is generally more socialist or communist. Well, in this case, it's not really like that because, well, as we know, Russia isn't communist, South Africa isn't communist, India isn't communist. But there's still this residue from the Cold War where they feel like they have to aid each other against the perceived outside Western threat.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree with you. And when you look at the size of the economies that we're talking about, namely India and China, it's not just as, it's not trivial. This is not a trivial partnership. This is not something that the West can look at and say, it won't hurt us or it won't affect us. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be confrontational, but I think in essence the reason why it actually exists is a response to it, to the West. Therefore, there is some degree of confrontation there. My question, I guess, is there a need for people to be worried about it? Because obviously we're all students of history here, and we see before World War I or World War II, you see an increase in kind of a polarization, whether it's certain countries making alliances with one another and certain other countries with other countries. You can kind of see that pattern. Is that kind of repeating itself, or is this completely different in that it's purely economical, for example?
I think it does repeat itself. Well, I'm sounding like a realist here, but history has repeated itself many times, I guess. And well, according to he is a Goldman Sachs economist, but I have it in front of me, Jim O'Neill. He coined the term BRIC, that back then BRIC, because South Africa hadn't joined yet in 2001. He said that it was poised to challenge the dominant G7 wealthy economies. Mm-hmm. So it is obviously, I think, well, if it's not public or direct, it is sort of a challenge. Mm-hmm. Like you said, I agree with both of you. Would I be worried? I think it's mainly economical. We've been polarized between East and West since World War II, yeah. I guess. So I feel like I wouldn't be that worried about BRICS per se, but it's still you can't really say what would happen. It is for now mainly economic, but who knows?
Well, it's
really.
economical between all the countries of BRICS, but when then it comes obviously to Russia and China, it's a bit different as a story. But then it's not necessarily BRICS as an
Yeah, that was
organization.
my
It's
point,
nation
yeah.
states dealing with nation states.
Exactly.
So it's different. But at the same time, you could kind of point that argument to the West when you say, okay, sure, NATO exists, for example, but NATO is mostly American-made weapons and resources and supplies, whatever. Realistically, NATO would not exist, at least not even at 50% of the strength that it would be if America was not involved in NATO. Couldn't BRICS kind of be a similar situation if Russia and China decide to put up all the money for defense, if they decide to invest in that sort of thing?
Probably yes, but what I have to say is we're looking at it from a Western perspective, because we're sort of more aligned with the West than the East in Malta. So maybe if you flip the switch and you ask, for example, someone from China or Russia, they could see maybe G7, the G7 economies, countries, as sort of a way to keep them down or something, or and push themselves up.
And there is some sympathy towards those opinions, because in reality, when you look at the G7 countries, and I don't really want to get into the historical debate about colonization. It's not even that. It's more about, the last 100 years in and of itself. You have seen a lot of abuse of power by the G7 countries. So I completely understand why something like BRICS has happened. I guess the worry is whether it can be taken too far. I know recently I read somewhere that BRICS were hoping to establish their own currency. But don't hold me to that, because I'm not necessarily certain. And I read basically the goal would be to undermine the US dollar, which is obviously the main currency used for most trade deals in the world, giving it a lot of power, naturally, both economic and politically, because when you have that kind of leverage, you have political power. Now, whether or not that is what I'm saying is true, because as I've said, I'm not necessarily certain. It brings into question, if you have a unipolar world and you try and make it bipolar, essentially, how does that not end up in confrontation and violence?
Well, looking at this from a purely historic point of view, well, you must protect the balance of power. A unipolar world, as we're speaking about here, is not really a world without conflict. No, it's just a world where one power controls everything. So if there was a smaller nation, like, for instance, Afghanistan, who wants to do its own thing, well, the unipolar power, which in our case was America, would not allow that. Because their imperial interest come before all the other minor nations.
Yeah.
So, yes, okay, you are trying to recreate a bipolar world, but I think that's overall will actually lead to less conflict, because there is now a stronger deterrent in the form of another strong power who can protect or align other countries to their side.
I have heard that argument before, and that bipolarity is actually more peaceful than unipolarity. Obviously, that you can argue and debate it, but I think there is wisdom to see in that, because when you look at the Cold War, yes, there were proxy conflicts. It was clearly not a violence-free time, but if you think about what was the Cold War compared to the exactly the years before the Cold War, the previous 40 years, and you kind of compare the violence, you can't really match it, because the Cold War was a significantly more peaceful time than World War I and World War II, obviously. But then obviously you have to ask the question whether it was actually down to the bipolarity of the Cold War, or it was just other reasons. I mean, realistically, if we're looking at it, I think purely logically, both World War I and World War II were similar in that there was countries making alliances that created kind of a bipolar division. So realistically, the same way you can kind of say the argument, hey, the Cold War was a bit more peaceful than the previous years, you can't really claim, in my opinion, that one of those years was unipolar and one of those years was bipolar. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
No, absolutely. I mean, the world before 1945 cannot be, looked at in the same lens that we view the world after 1945.
Obviously,
You
for
had-
so many reasons.
I mean, back then you had a plurality of powers. It was not an issue of unipolar or bipolar. No. I mean, you had regional powers influencing their own areas. I mean, you had the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the British who controlled their vast colonies. Very different from the modern world where you see an America who controls a lot of other nations through diplomacy rather than, direct conquest or tributary states.
I want to play devil's advocate on what you just said a bit there. You said America controls a lot of nation states through diplomacy.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily that I disagree with you, but how is it that they control them, whereas those nation states don't, negotiate for themselves? Because when you say it like that, it's kind of implying that these nation states are essentially all puppets.
I wouldn't say that they are puppets because, I mean, this is like a worker in a union. There is an agreement between them. It's just that,
One of them is more powerful.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, when you hold all the power, you have a bigger economy, you have nuclear capabilities. In the case of America, you are quite literally financing the armies of all at least, if not all, most of the other NATO countries. You are in the position of power. The other countries practically owe you for the economic benefits that you are providing.
Yes. No, I agree with that. So, in fact, there's a specific reason why the America First kind of non-interventionist political movement has made a lot of significant progress in America, because a lot of people in America think, why are we financing that thing or that country's military? Like, the priority is the country first. And I think, sadly, America has not taken that approach for basically since World War II, even before, you could argue. And now maybe it's going to start to change. Now, if the BRICS countries were a result of that America not being isolationist and not being America first and being basically involved everywhere else, if that policy actually changes, we're yet to see, obviously, what Trump will do. But if that policy actually changes, then is BRICS a bit more redundant?
I mean, the very special relation which BRICS has with itself. I mean, you see most Western commentators like to chalk up BRICS as, it's just the Russian NATO.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but then you look at which countries are actually in it. For instance, you have China and India.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those two states are most of the time, opposed to one another. So when you see a purely economic I wouldn't even call it an alliance. I think it's more of an agreement between these nations. You have to think, why would these countries rather work with China and Russia than with the Americans? Now, of course, in the case of India, there is work with both sides being done. In fact, I'm pretty sure America considers India one of, I wouldn't say main allies, but it's a principal ally in the region, for certain.
Yes.
And the fight against the Chinese. But even then, I mean, yeah, I would absolutely say that it's all a reaction to the monopolar world. Well, unipolar, but yeah.
Same word.
Exactly same word. What I will say is, just to confirm, in 2023 August, Brazil's president called for the BRICS nations to create a common currency. But he named it a long-term plan, not an immediate plan. And basically, de-dollarization is one of BRICS'...
Yes, that's the exact word I heard, yeah.
De-dollarization is one of BRICS' main things, because they're worried of the effect of the dollar. They express concerns about the dominance of the US dollar in global trade, which gives the US significant leverage, is what the BRICS countries say. And it's a long-term goal for sure, but they will... but they would probably look at that in the future.
I think, yeah. That is a very, very big thing, because firstly, it's not just, taking power away from America, but it's a clear statement of intent as to what the goals actually are. The goals actually are to get out from under that US hegemon, that US kind of spotlight, where you're protected and, I guess threatened to some degree, where you don't really have any power, to kind of, back away from that and put yourself under someone else's umbrella. Now, obviously, the question will remain: can you really trust the other, BRICS the countries? But realistically, you cannot say. Us in the West, we might say you can't trust China, you can't trust Russia, you can't trust whatever. But that obviously comes with a certain knowledge that we are in the West, we are influenced by Western ideology, so you can't really just, dismiss these countries because you can't trust them, especially if you're coming from the West. Now, the question is should you be skeptical? Obviously, you should be, because, hey, if you're living in a country that is not really part of the Western hegemony, but not really part of BRICS either way, and you kind of are hedging your bets who to go for. This is a hypothetical scenario, obviously, but if you trust BRICS more, you should still be capable of them being as reprehensible as some other countries might think the US is. And realistically, I don't think just because BRICS exists, it means that everything the West does is bad, and just because the West exists, everything the BRICS does will be good.
Yeah.
So it isn't easy to analyze. It's definitely difficult.
I mean, here I would argue that looking at this issue through a lens of, good and bad, kind of strays from the main point which BRICS is trying to establish here, which is, from my point of view at least, it's this idea that, hey, listen, America has consistently, been a threat to our way of life. I mean, at least, especially in places like Russia, they view Americans in the same way that the Americans view the Russians. I mean, yes, in the West, we had the idea of possible nuclear conflict, with bunkers and whatnot. And that fear, of the Russians, with the Cuban crisis and the Russian nukes. Well, for the Russians, it was much the same.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't expect that in 30 years. Well, actually, it was less, because when BRICS formed, it was 10 years after the Soviet Union.
No, BRICS formed in I think, no, it was more than 10 years.
You said
It
2000.
was coined in 2001, but they formed officially, I think it was 2009. Yeah, founded June 16, 2009 as BRICS.
So the idea existed.
Yeah, the idea existed before because they were already integrating mainly, is what I am seeing in front of me. Also, the fact that there are not just the BRICS countries, there are 9 countries in BRICS as well.
Yes, I know there's more.
Yeah,
and the more have applied to join.
Yeah, and for example, one of them is the United Arab Emirates.
Right.
That's economically a big boost.
And the United Arab Emirates has actually good relations with the America.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I don't think it's that worrying. I don't think it's that worrying. Really.
No, I don't particularly think it's worrying as in because BRICS exists. My worry is now what will be the response to BRICS from the West.
Okay, fair enough.
Because, so the West, obviously, there's a lot of things you can kind of incorporate into the West, which is NATO, the EU, America, obviously, Canada, and the G7 countries, essentially. Yes. Those are objectively the West. What will be the response to BRICS? Is there's going to be a response? What can they do? Let's speculate a bit. What can they do to kind of respond to BRICS as an economic challenge? Not necessarily a defense challenge, but as an economic challenge. Okay. What really can they do?
Can I correct myself? The BRICS political cooperation began in 2006. 2001 was the origin of the term, 2009 was the first summit, and 2010 it became BRICS when South Africa joined.
Right.
That's to fact check myself.
Yes.
You guys can continue.
Did you hear the question, or shall I repeat it?
Repeat it.
Yes.
What can the West do, right?
What can the West do as a response to BRICS is essentially my question.
So what can the West do, and what does it appear that the West will do?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in my mind, are two completely separate questions,
obviously,
which I will, discuss a bit here. So what can the West do? I mean, currently, it seems to me like they're taking a very militaristic approach to it. Especially, of course, in the case of Russia and China, they're trying to undermine China everywhere, especially in the South China Sea, with Taiwan. While, of course, you have the Ukrainian-Russian crisis still ongoing with the invasion. And yeah, it seems like that is the path which the West has chosen to take, to oppose, these countries at every turn, to render them economically unstable with their sanctions.
Yes, in fact, that was one of the arguments for why the Americans are kind of giving resources to Ukraine, so they can prolong this war as much as possible, so that the Russians are so economically hit that they end up a much less powerful state. I guess that's one of the arguments. So in a way, I see what you're saying. Yes, there is a militaristic response when it comes to Russia, for example. Yes, I agree with you. But what else, realistically?
Well, just to not play devil's advocate, but for the military response to Russia, not devil's advocate really, they both responded militarily. So both the US and Russia.
You're saying when Russia invaded?
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
So that's, they are seeing it militarily, but there's also another conflict going on at the same time. So don't know if really that's the response to BRICS per se.
Yeah, in fact, that's my point of difference, I think, is because I think it's more just a response of geopolitics rather than a response to BRICS per se.
Exactly, because that's the thing. They're all part of so many things. You have G7, BRICS, then it's just the states themselves. Some conflicts between the states, like you said in the beginning, will be seen as sort of a threat to BRICS or something, or I'm just speculating now. But it's a bit weird as to where you would draw the line. Where would you draw the line, really?
What do you mean?
Because, for example, the US and Russia have been in conflict now. Well, US and Russia, Ukraine and Russia, but US obviously backing Ukraine. And then you just said that the West, I believe you said that the West are responding militarily towards BRICS. But is the military response towards BRICS or towards the state of Russia?
Yeah, I mean, both Russia and China are being
But where would you draw the line?
Then again, at the same time.
Oh, but you have to look at it this way. I mean, Russia wants to de-dollarize. Is that the word they used?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not Russia, BRICS.
De-dollarizing.
In fact, it was the Brazilian Prime Minister last year who said this.
Exactly. I mean, this is, it's a BRICS initiative.
Yeah, I don't think if it's officially a BRICS initiative per se, it's just what's being said mainly. But still, I mean, that's the main. Yeah. If they said it directly.
With the Ukrainian war, I think ultimately, firstly, I don't think it has anything to do with BRICS when it comes to the Ukraine war. If anything,
oh no, it doesn't.
I think it has to do with trying to weaken Russia economically from the Western perspective. But take a step back from that. Realistically, the Americans' involvement in Ukraine goes on to prove the point that BRICS are trying to prove, which is that the West is clearly way too powerful and it feels too arrogant, in fact, to have to involve itself everywhere. Because realistically, there's no reason why the Americans should be giving weapons to Ukraine. There's no treaty that says so. They're not in NATO. So
Ukraine aren't in NATO.
Yes, obviously. There is no particular agreement where the West has to come to Ukraine's rescue for an invasion. Now, obviously, you're going to tell me, so what, you just let Putin do whatever he wants? That's not the argument being made. The argument being made is that realistically it's because the West has taken upon itself the title of policeman of the world, essentially, where they need to kind of make sure that conflicts are solved, despite the fact that they're almost never solved and take 20 years. But that's not the point. The point is, why did they get involved? If they got involved because to extend military might around the world, then it proves BRICS' point of the West is too big. If it's to weaken Russia economically, it might not prove any BRICS points, but at the same time, it's trying to weaken one of the main countries of BRICS. So whether or not we can decide or argue that BRICS or NATO or whatever are confrontational, I think what you're definitely seeing is from the West that there is definitely an active response/action against BRICS countries, whether or not they're doing it as an organization or to the separate states. So the point that BRICS countries make, which is that the West is too big and the West is too involved in everything it wants to be, whether those people, wherever they are, want them to be there, is definitely proven correct, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, just to sort of answer you, I'm on the US DOS, the Department of State site, and on I think like just today week, last week, they updated at least a fact sheet, which says that the United States have not forgotten Russia's earlier aggression in eastern Ukraine and occupation following its unlawful seizure of Crimea in 2014. The United States reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. That goes on, and then it just says the data. Doesn't really say why they are involved.
I guess the point being made implying
It's just
that
unlawful.
because Russia broke the law.
Yeah,
and
which the US hasn't done, I don't think. Huh? That's
yeah,
sarcastic.
Exactly.
For,
I was about to say,
Yeah.
When it's coming from the US about someone else breaking the law, it's rich.
Yeah, it is
I
very
mean, you
rich.
can smell the foul play on it from miles away. Again, that's not to say that Russia's invasion was justified, but that's another conversation altogether. Point is, they had no legal standing or agreement with Ukraine to actually give them the weapons and keep on giving them more escalatory weapons that would anger further Russia. So then, as I said, it proves the point that BRICS are making, which is that, look, the Americans, yes, we get it, you're powerful. Yes, we get it, you're influential. It doesn't mean that you need to come into this country and this region and try to stabilize or destabilize or do whatever you want. Because guess what? The people there have territorial integrity. They have independence. They have a country. You can't just enter into it basically saying whatever you want. Now, obviously, people will look at me and say, well, that's what Putin did in Ukraine. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying when it's the US calling them out, I don't really tend to believe anything they say after that.
Fair enough, and you're entitled not to believe because I'm somewhat in agreement with you. Mm-hmm. Because that it is rich coming from the US. I don't want to because we already talked about Russia, Ukraine now as well, so I don't want to repeat. But still, it's weird that the US are involved. But I don't think, again, going back to BRICS, where would you draw the line between that being a BRICS initiative or it being a state initiative? Or is the line
okay, so
very
if we're
blurry?
talking about the Ukrainian war, I think that's a state issue. I don't think that's a BRICS.
Yeah, exactly. But then it's not really a military response to BRICS from the US if they support Ukraine, is my opinion.
No, I agree with you. It isn't a response to BRICS, but it is in essence proving one of BRICS' main points, essentially,
Yeah, fair enough.
points that the Americans are too big and too powerful and they do whatever they want.
Yeah, fair enough. But then you can sorry.
Yeah. Plus, at the same time, the way that the West views the rest, it's very paranoid, in my opinion. I mean, they're constantly, finding these rogue regimes and, pointing towards them and saying, hey, listen, these people go against our values of freedom and democracy, and we must oppose them in every way we can. I mean, I think that currently a prime example of that would be Iran, Russia and China, once again. So I think it's all just this giant amalgamation of of nations and countries, which the US just views as hostile. Mm-hmm. And
I agree with you, actually, because when you look at it, for example, when Donald Trump met with Kim Jong-un and then when he met with Putin many times, and Trump tends to speak very vaguely but very quickly, and then he basically kind of says nothing, but at the same time, he has this way of speaking where he says everyone is a great guy and he respects everyone, right? Now, from a business perspective, you can tell why he's doing it. He's doing it because it's for looks and basically just to not really piss anyone off, in my opinion. But when you look at Trump, who was willing to talk and meet with Kim Jong-un, I mean, this is the first American president who's been at the DMZ in Korea. Mm-hmm. And to meet with Putin multiple times, to actually have good words to say about Putin. Now, as people will think that is reprehensible, but look at it from a logical perspective of someone who is negotiating. I mean, if you have a business deal with someone, you're not going to talk badly about them behind their back publicly, obviously.
If we're going to make an argument, pushing towards peace, we can't go in with the bad faith, intention of, this guy is literally Hitler. He's the devil incarnate. I mean, if you're going to negotiations with that mindset, how can you ever achieve peace?
That's not negotiations. That's sham. That's political theater at that point. But my point being is that, yes, you're right. There is this paranoia from the West where they see a lot of countries as indefinitely hostile. Now, when it comes to, for example, Middle Eastern countries that, where a lot of Islamic terrorism comes out from, you can kind of see what the events happened that led up to that. For example, in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen were originally, U.S. forces and not as in American forces, but U.S. trained forces, and then they turned into the Taliban, which is completely against America. So that's a situation where you have American actions kind of ending up with the worst consequences possible. Whereas when you're talking about Russia specifically more than China, I think it's exactly as you said, it's incredibly deep paranoia. And I think there was literally, and has still been literally, no actual effect of negotiation or communication or trying to establish some sort of rules or treaties, nothing, basically, since Trump got in office the first time? Maybe even before, probably even before. There would be summits, obviously, between Russia and the US, but then when you look at it now, 20 years after, especially with, the invasion, how effective were those negotiations? Clearly not very. So you have to, put things into perspective where some things the US can be paranoid for justified reasons, and some things they're paranoid for reasons that they caused themselves. Again, proving, in my opinion, BRICS' point that the Americans are way too powerful.
And this is why I was making the argument that, at least in the Western mind, yes, of course, the military response in places like Ukraine is primarily, about Russia and not about BRICS. But at the same time, you cannot deny the fact that they are paranoid about the other countries, and if weakening one of them helps weaken the other, that is a desirable outcome of the intervention.
Yes, yeah, I agree with you. There's I remember the comedian George Carlin. I don't know if you ever saw any of his things. He was a very outspoken anti-government comedian, but he was hilarious. This is in the 80s or 90s in America.
Okay.
And he was once talking about basically how power consolidates within government and the corrupt. And he made a point where you don't need conspiracies. You don't need people meeting in secret courts, at 3 a.m. in the morning in a secret location. Because when interests converge, people know exactly what's good for everyone. You know what I'm saying? So applying that parallel to what you just said, which is they're not necessarily doing it to weaken BRICS, but weakening Russia de facto weakens BRICS. So it's converging onto one another, and it's kind of making sense that it's a desired outcome, as you just said.
Yes.
With regards to China, I think it's a bit different because it feels like the posturing of America on China kind of changes at times. I don't know if you agree with me. What do you guys think?
It's changed over the years. I think it's pretty consistent nowadays, at least. Mm-hmm. Why would you say it changed?
Do you think they're more hostile towards China than they are towards Russia, the US?
Depends on who's in government.
Yeah, and that's a big question. Because I think economically they may be more hostile towards China right now. Economically, I'm not really 100% sure.
The thing with China is the amount of trade deals that they have, especially with Europe, not just with America. Yeah. I think they have much more economic leverage than the Russians do.
Nowadays, yes. And also, this just came to mind with Trump's potential tariffs on China. He mentioned quite a bit of tariffs and economic sanctions towards China. So maybe, like JP said, it depends on who's in government. Because I think Trump's more hostile towards China, he will be more hostile towards China than Russia.
I think Trump, I wouldn't say the word hostile, I would more say the word something more like strict/harsh.
Okay.
Because when it comes to negotiation, it pays off to be a bit more, how would you say, I guess, a bit more cold, naturally. You don't want to let emotions, run your own argument.
Yeah, fair enough.
So when it comes to US and China, I think it's different because I think the confrontation is mostly economical. Whereas when it comes to Russia and US, we have seen that the confrontation, I think, is more militaristic in nature. I mean, Russia has probably the second largest military industrial complex in the world, I think. I don't think China has a bigger one.
I'll look it up.
Look it up, but I think Russia has the biggest military industrial complex.
Second biggest.
Yeah, sorry, second biggest, yes. Obviously, the America's the first. Anyway, point is, there is more confrontation to be had about economics with China than there is with Russia. Now, Russia obviously had, for example, the pipelines to Europe, but but at the same time, I don't think that they were as impactful as all the deals that China has with Europe. What did you find? Yeah,
The US is first, China second,
China's second.
and then Russia third, Saudi Arabia fourth.
How close is Russia to China?
So what? United States is a $600 billion industry.
Yeah.
China's 112 billion.
Uh-huh.
Russia's 68 billion. So there's
I
like.
got that wrong. So from what year is it? Do you have a year for or that?
Oh wait, no, this is 2016.
2016.
Oh god, no, sorry.
See,
Sorry, my
no,
bad.
that's the thing. Hopefully, I'm proven right because I think obviously Russia has massively increased their military spending, naturally due to the war, obviously. So I'm assuming I'm right in saying that it's probably the second largest military.
Yeah,
industry.
but at the same time, China has also increased. I mean, they had conflicts with
Yes.
India on the border, also Taiwan.
Yes, that is true. But I think what we have seen, Russia has the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world, or the first, actually.
No, Russia has the biggest nuclear.
The biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. We have seen recently the use of the hypersonic.
ICBM.
I think the missile is called Oreshin, something like that. I had it on my ChatGPT yesterday, but I can't remember it correctly. Anyway,
ChatGPT mentioned. Oh, no.
point is there's with BRICS. I think the real worry is the fact that there's a few countries that specialize on certain things, and then there's countries that specialize more on other things. For example, China's much more economically tied with the Europeans than Russia is. I think. I'm pretty sure.
Well, I mean, today.
When it comes to trade deficits and surpluses.
Today, yeah, because, Russia is sanctioned by the West, so couldn't be any other way.
And I think there's more to gain from that. And I think China, for example, has a lot of, owns a lot of the, NBA, I believe. There's a lot of entertainment industries that there's a lot of economic interest from China in. I mean, when you see so many movies from Hollywood come out and premieres happen in China, for example, because of the economic ties between Hollywood and China, for example. There's things that I don't think most people realize, that funding is very important, especially where it comes from, for whatever project you have in your mind. And a lot of these things are funded by China. This is not to say that, if you're watching a Hollywood movie, you're aiding to China's communism or something like that. All I'm saying is that this is how nation states work. This is how nation states fund things. And you must not be blind to the influence that these countries can have. So, that's one of my main points. And also, for example, you have the United Nations, which encompass, I think, 197 countries, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. Almost 100 countries, anyway. And obviously, the EU has like 28 or 27 member states.
27. Yeah.
I think 27.
27.
And then there's NATO, which has, I don't know how many, but I'm assuming a bit more than the European Union as member states.
Not sure.
No, BRICS at the moment you said is 9 countries, right?
9 countries, yeah. NATO members is I think it's 32, I'm not sure.
Something like that. It's a bit more than the European Union.
Yeah, 32 countries and the European Union is 27.
No, BRICS only has 9 countries, sorry. At this point, I wouldn't say that there's any realistic either confrontation or strong competition in that the EU will become very powerless, for example, because of BRICS. I don't think that's going to be the case. However, soon probably you'll have more countries wanting to join BRICS. Do you think there's going to be countries that will want to join BRICS by kind of isolating themselves from other Western organizations that they may be a part of?
Just to confirm, because I finally found it, according to SIPRI, which is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, US largest with 966 billion, military industrial complex estimates, China second with around 300 billion, and then Russia's third.
See, I got it wrong. Fair enough. I don't mind being fact-checked. Anyway, my question was basically 9 countries in BRICS, potential to join, potential to have more members. Do you think that some of those countries might actually come from the West? Do you think that's even possible?
Possibly yes, probably no.
Mm-hmm. Why not?
I think it's just too close ties to the US, per se.
Mm-hmm.
And also, for example, from where would the country come? Because I don't see a European country.
For example, I'll give you an example. Hungary. Hungary has been under a lot of pressure, especially in the European Union, for their kind of anti-funding Ukraine stance that they've taken.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of European countries that I would say are probably disenfranchised with the European Union. Even Poland, for example, you could mention. Perhaps Italy. Perhaps.
I would disagree.
Due to the migrant issue. That's what I'm
but even Poland and Hungary.
pointing
Also.
at. Yes, yes.
Poland mainly.
Anyway, the
continent.
point is that I'm making is, could there be countries that are disenfranchised with the Western kind of hegemon that they turn towards BRICS? And if that somehow happens, are we looking at sanctions towards those countries? Because, obviously Russia and China are somewhat sanctioned. Well, Russia sanctioned definitely. China, there's definitely some sanctions. Would countries like Hungary, if they decide, hey, let's leave the EU, let's ally ourselves with BRICS, would they get sanctioned? Because then in that case, I think there is a much more clear argument to say it isn't just two economic kind of poles, but it is actually confrontational to the degree that there might be more than just sanctions but violence.
If Hungary do leave the Union and join BRICS, for example, it would be just, I'll be blunt here, it'll be a stupid decision. Because I don't see any EU country really join. They could be aligned politically, but I don't think.
But is it a stupid decision because of consequences that they might receive, or is it because the economic benefits from BRICS are just not good enough?
All of the above.
It doesn't really make sense to leave the customs union,
Exactly.
when you were surrounded by it.
For example, I know you're saying hypotheticals, but from a European country's perspective, this is my European studying coming in. Single market, I'll just correct you, not common market. I'll just correct you. Sorry if I feel like sorry.
Sure.
I'm kidding, because it's different technically, but that's a different story. I feel like I can't say that word. Sorry. To leave the single market and then potentially, for example, mention Brexit. England felt disenfranchised, quote unquote disenfranchised with the European Union, and they left, and there was a trade agreement signed. There is a trade agreement, a regional trade agreement with the EU and Brexit. If a country decides to leave the Union and potentially join BRICS, I don't know if they'd negotiate a trade agreement. Obviously, it would be beneficial for both because you trade more, but for the country, for example, like Hungary in the Union, would it make sense leaving a single market, leaving the economic benefits and just economic benefits from the Union to join BRICS? I don't think at this point in time BRICS is that big or as big in terms of influence. That the European Union has much more influence, in my opinion, than BRICS.
People
obviously
didn't even hear about BRICS until 5 seconds ago.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't think people listening to this or seeing this will know about BRICS mainly, or a few people will. But even outside of the Union, like in the rest of the world, the European Union has more influence than BRICS mostly. That's just the Brussels effect and stuff like that. That's another long story.
We do live in a Eurocentric. Well, we used to live in a Eurocentric world, but I think there's a lot.
It's shifted now.
But I think there's a lot of what's the word? Kind of it carries on, within generations.
Yeah, it's a cycle sort of. But the European Union lost influence definitely, but it still has a lot of, not mainly just influence, economic influence.
Okay, but here's a question. Is the European Union kind of losing influence progressively, or is it, or it has lost a bit, but it's kind of gaining it back? Because and I'll make this point, not only with just Brexit happening, but even when you have someone like Trump who's openly critical of European countries, especially when it comes to NATO, for example, and you have many countries within Europe who don't really respect the Union in certain things. I think, in my opinion, I would say that the EU is losing valuable influence, and I think if it doesn't put a stop to that by gaining the honest respect of the countries that are members, I think it might head for a worse outcome.
Before I answer you, why do you think it's losing influence?
For the reasons I just said. I think the fact that it lost Britain, and then basically Britain butchered the deal. I'm not As in, so Britain obviously voted to leave. Then the deal took 4 years to draft. Britain went through like 3 or 4 prime ministers, or I don't know how many. And then kind of they got not a really particularly good deal. Now, does that reflect badly on the EU? Not necessarily. It kind of reflects badly on Britain, obviously.
Yeah,
but at the same time, you have to realize Britain as a state, as a country, who Britain is, and you can't discount that. For nothing. And at the same time, it emboldens obviously other countries to think, hey, if we don't think that we agree with the EU, why should we stay?
Well,
now, apart from that, you've had a lot of controversies. I mean, for example, you could talk about Ursula von der Leyen, which is a massively unpopular commissioner in a lot of European countries, specifically Eastern European countries that are in the EU. I'm not a big fan of hers either. And you can kind of constantly see this assimilation of the EU as opposed to being an independent organization regional to Europe. A lot of people are starting to see it as just basically a puppet of the Americans in Europe. And I think that allows people to consider it differently, because I think it loses influence that way. I don't think people view it with respect.
No, I disagree with you almost completely. But I don't think it's a puppet of the US. Because
I'm not saying I'm saying the arguments are given fuel.
I see. I don't really agree with that. Economically, we have to thank the US, unfortunately. Not unfortunately, but I don't really like them politically currently. But we do have to give them their credit, because without the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, we wouldn't be in a union as strong as it is right now, probably. Still, I don't think it's a puppet, and I don't think it's losing influence within itself, because I think we might be saying that now, because even the commission was changing, but the new commission got sworn in, or at least they got voted in last night, and it was like 380 voted for it in the parliament and 270 something voted against, so that's actually not that bad. But still, I don't think it's losing influence even globally, because okay, it's not losing interest or losing its respect. It's changing, because the European Union now is not what the European Union was 20 years ago. It's totally different, and the world is different. Even with China's rise, it is different. 20 years ago, it was just Europe and the US mainly. Russia wasn't as big as it was.
I agree with what you're saying, but the thing is, when you look at even, for example, their stance on the Israel conflict and their completely opposite stance on the Ukrainian conflict,
yeah, I mean,
when you look at it as an organization, I think a lot of people look at it and say that's hypocritical, pointing fingers at them. You're not really helping anyone, essentially, and that, to me at least, makes the European Union from the project which it was a good idea to try and bring Europe into peace, essentially. But then when people are looking at things that make it look hypocritical, they will say essentially, you're not really doing anything to help, in the sense by, for example, saying countless and countless times that you want the Ukraine to join the European Union and NATO, knowing that full well that does not ease tensions, that completely escalates, and then you're constantly about a ceasefire in Gaza while not condemning Israel. It's something that makes you think, wait, why is the EU taking the exact same geopolitical stance as the US, right?
Well, I mean, to me, there's a clear answer to that. It's not the EU's fault. It's just that most of the EU member states are also part of NATO. So there's this overlap of interest.
Exactly.
Now, of course, I agree with you that militarily speaking, Europe is too reliant on the Americans. In fact, this week, the EPP had a meeting here in Malta locally, where the speaker for the EPP openly admitted that, hey, Trump is right when it comes to the military. He said it doesn't make sense for 300 million Americans to have to burden themselves with the defense of 400 million Europeans. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another interesting issue which will come out of Trump's America First policy, that suddenly Europe will have to finance its own militaries, its own defense. Now, of course,
with military, this will discuss this further in another episode probably.
Yeah,
but with military, I'm mainly in disagreement with most people, because I don't think there should be a European army. And
I agree with you, actually.
Okay, then. one more to the team. But even just the mutual defense clause, for me, it's enough right now. But that's another argument to get back to BRICS and the influence. I still don't feel like BRICS is really to go back to your question of would a Western country join BRICS. Again, from where? Because the West would involve the US, maybe Canada, and then Europe.
That fair enough. It was more of a hypothetical.
Yeah, I know. But I don't think. I think the Union is stronger than people think, really. But they just think it's weak because it doesn't have a military. But then, if it does appear strong with a military, what would that do? It would just
that would not make things better.
Exactly. Then with BRICS economically...
I even take it from the Russian perspective. So the Russian perspective all this time throughout the Ukraine has been because we don't want the missiles of NATO in that close to our largest neighbor, essentially. That is more or less the argument, whether you believe it or not, right? Now imagine Russia wakes up one morning and all of the European states decided to create one specific army, one general army, when you just said the population of Europe is 400 million or something like that, right? Like,
I did say that.
You did say that.
The EPP said that.
Sorry. See, I misquoted. Anyway, well, put it that way. There's states in Europe which are separate nation states, but they all share the one common army. So imagine a country of 400 million people having one army, and you're going to tell me that Russia's going to be happy with that. Now, obviously, you can tell me, what can Russia do? Like, realistically, what are they going to do? But the problem is not that. The problem is the tension. You don't really want to escalate tensions.
It's a security dilemma.
Exactly. Escalating arms always leads to escalating tensions.
Yeah.
So...
I wouldn't agree fully here. I mean, today I tend to agree more than disagree. But if you look at, you go back to the Merkel days, I mean, Chancellor Merkel worked strongly, in her concept of sort of uniting the interests of Europe with those of Russia. I mean, most famously, she did this with the gas pipeline. But I do believe that Europe and Russia have a higher chance of peace than Europe and America. I mean, than Russia and America.
Yeah.
Purely due to, old Cold War grudges. So if Europe were to become less dependent on the Americans when it comes to the actual military aspect, I believe there would be more room for negotiation.
Yes, that opens the door to more peaceful terms, I guess, between Russia and Europe. I think that's what you're saying. Because I guess if they get their own military, they're a bit more independent, militarily speaking, than they are now. I agree.
From the Russian perspective,
yes,
the EU is just a giant NATO base.
Yeah, that's the thing, because there's a lot of overlapping. That's what JP said. There is. In fact, in 2004, the largest enlargement of Europe, there were 4 countries which joined Europe, or 3 countries which joined Europe and NATO in the same year, and 2 more countries in Europe which joined NATO in the same year, in 2004. The overlapping is there. Now I'm going to ask a question, if it's possible. The episode is on the shifting world order. Where would you put BRICS, maybe Europe, the EU, the US, Russia, G7? Where would you put them in the world order ranking?
Well, I think still the most powerful is more NATO than I think is the EU.
Yeah, that's definite. Militarily, yes. Economically, I don't think so.
Look, I understand you can argue about economic power and military power, and which is more important, and you need both and whatever. But realistically, the one who can wave the biggest shtick has the most power.
Yeah, fair enough. But that's the problem with... I don't know. I think this is just me being a passive person.
I think so, yeah. Because I think if you think realistically about it, you have the most armaments, you have the most weapons. I think that de facto makes you the most powerful. I'll tell you how significant that is. You have the EU. Okay, sure, it's a very powerful organization. I'm not saying it isn't, and it's very influential. But you have the NATO. You have one little conflict with one of those countries, and it's not the European countries that are involved, it's America as well that is involved by law. Now, you can argue that kind of Ukraine, as I just said previously, Ukraine was attacked and the US got involved without any real legal reasoning behind it. But my point being is that NATO is significantly more threatening than all of the other organizations, in my opinion. So therefore, I think it is the most powerful. Not maybe the most influential, but I think it's obviously the most powerful.
I don't think it makes much sense to compare and contrast NATO and the EU just because of how great the overlap between the two actually is.
Yeah, that's also
No,
another
yes,
thing.
of course. But my point is, ultimately, if there was no NATO, if NATO didn't exist, the EU would not be as influential as it is now. I think you would agree. Because it gives them defensive security.
Yeah, but the states give defensive security to themselves. If one European state is attacked, the mutual defense clause states that all states can then attack.
Yes, but then there's NATO
Those
and there's...
armies are financed by the Americans.
Exactly, that's why the overlap is strong.
Yeah, exactly. Point is, if there was no NATO, then there would be no American financing of that things.
Yeah, but then that goes back to before NATO as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm saying like 2 years before NATO here.
Yes, okay, but you're still making the same argument.
Yeah, it is the same argument, but this is just. Then there's another argument of should NATO still exist, but that's just a whole different.
We can do an episode on that.
Yeah, exactly.
To be honest.
And with the time we have left, I don't think it's possible.
NATO has been justified now through the invasion.
Let's not talk about it now.
I mean, come on.
I want to play devil's advocate so badly, but unfortunately we can't.
Oh, okay.
With that said, we're gonna conclude today's episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to our ranting on BRICS, which we clearly know so much about. It's insane.
It's about the world order, not.
It's about sharing opinions, whether or not it's true or not. We'll kind of fix it as we go along. Obviously, we're still new to this. So thank you for listening and watching, maybe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.